Today we have with us Professor Willem van Schendel from University of Amsterdam, who is here to attend an international conference at Jamia Millia Islamia on the northeastern issues. Welcome to Rajya Sabha TV, Professor Schendel.
Thank you.
And you have given the keynote address to this international conference, and I have seen your profile. You are working a lot on this region. You have bring out too many books on Bangladesh, Myanmar, India. So please tell us your impressions about northeastern states in India.
That's a very difficult question to answer because everybody who talks about Northeast India will tell you that there's so many different parts of that region. It's only from the point of view of perhaps Delhi that you think of Northeast India. When you're in Northeast India, you are much more aware of the differentiation of the region, how different various political and cultural and economic processes develop there. So it's hard to speak about Northeast India as a whole.
So what was the reason, what inspired you to focus on this part of the world?
I started out doing research on Bengal. I'm an anthropologist and a historian, and I was very interested in studying the sort of developments in the recent history of Bengal, and I started in Bangladesh, in East Bengal, doing research. Then I came back for my PhD research there, and gradually I became more and more interested in how this part of the world is linked to the regions around it. So that's why I became interested in Northeast India and Burma and so on, because I think social scientists tend to study only national blocks. So they think about a state territory, and that becomes the part of the world that they study. And I think that's not the right way to do it. You should look at areas that tell you something about a specific research question you have, and that may not be contained within national borders.
You have also written a book about the Indigo during the colonial Bengal. So, what it gives you the narratives of what kind of situation were there at that time and how it developed?
That is a book that is to do with something that excites people at the moment, and that is the process of globalization. People talk a lot about it, and they have a lot of opinions about it, but many people are not aware that this is a very old process, the way the world has come together. Different trajectories of globalization have been going on for many centuries. And I was looking at one particular sort of trajectory, looking at one particular crop and product, indigo dye, and I was interested in looking at how different European imperial powers tried to get hold of that commodity, which was quite sought after in Europe at the time. And so what I'm interested in is really the way different European powers use this to enrich themselves.
Yeah, you were telling me that it was started by the Britishers and then it was sort of hijacked by the French.
Yeah, so it was started by the British. Actually, there was sort of an indigo industry in Europe, but when the Europeans gained colonial territories in tropical areas, they found out that indigo was much more productive there. So the Spanish started in Latin America, the French in the Caribbean, and the British in what is now the deep south of the US. Then those systems collapsed around 1800, and they had to find new places. So the British tried in British India, what they had in Bengal basically, which they had just acquired, as it were. and they were pretty successful. The Dutch tried it in Indonesia. They were not so successful, but a little bit better. And the French had a problem. They tried it in different places, didn't work out. So the book you're talking about is really a report by a Frenchman here in India who looked at how indigo was done, was produced here, and then took it to Senegal in West Africa, where the French wanted to set up their own indigo industry. And it worked for a little while, and then it collapsed. So the British remained the dominant indigo producers through their Indian possession.
So do you have any mention of Gandhi in that book? Because the national movement was started on this very issue from Bihar in Champaran area.
Sure, Gandhi played a role at the very end of the indigo production. I'm really interested in the beginning, which is late 18th, early 19th century.
Yes.
So of course there is a mention of him, but by the time he intervened in the last remnants of the indigo industry, the whole indigo system worldwide had collapsed, because by that time you had synthetic indigo being produced in Europe.
Professor Schendel, one of your area of interest is Borderlands and the social consequences of the mobility of people and the goods. So could you please tell us more about it?
But I think there is a tendency among historians and social scientists to think about borders from the centers of power. So when you're saying where we're now in Delhi, you think of the borders as being at the margins of society and so on. And I think it's very important for social scientists to also try and think the other way around, and to look at how people in border areas organize their lives and what the presence of the state means to them. So I tried that out by looking at the partition border between India and East Pakistan, or later Bangladesh, trying to figure out what happens when suddenly, say 70 years ago, a border descends in your world and your world is split. Suddenly you are an Indian citizen or a Pakistani citizen. What does that mean? And how did the border actually develop in those areas? So I did field work, I traveled around the border, and I looked at archives. Also
Myanmar, which was
also Myanmar, yes. But that's of course a fairly short border from the Bangladesh point of view, and larger on the Indian side.
Uh-huh. Now coming back to the issue of northeast of India and what we call it Seven Sisters. There are 35 million people, not very large amount of population, but more than 350 communities. So since you are an anthropologist also, could you please tell us about your study of that region, that northeast?
Okay, first of all, I'm from a country with far fewer inhabitants than northeast India.
Yes.
So for me it's not a small number of people. I've become very interested in one part of northeast India, Mizoram, partly because earlier I did a study on the Chittagong Hill Tracts in Bangladesh, which is next to Mizoram, where there was a lot of turbulence and sort of social unrest. And
because of Chakmas.
Chakma is one of the larger groups there, but there are other groups as well, and they opposed the Bangladesh government, and they're still the problems have not been resolved, although the level of violence is a bit less. And in Mizoram, I was very interested to see how historians had dealt with the developments there, especially because Mizoram was annexed to British India very late in the 1890s, and it was only after that you get sort of material that historians can do a lot with, because before that time the people were illiterate. There were, of course, some reports from outsiders, but most of them are always very biased. So I talked with a colleague here at JNU, Joy Pachwal, who is in the history department there, and we decided to do a project on what material you can find on the history of Mizoram, especially visual material. So what we've done is we went around Mizoram several times collecting photographs, mostly from private collections, people who have their family albums or have other collections that they wanted to share with us. So based on those photographs, and we were able to collect thousands of them, we tried to write a history of Mizoram that is not possible if you only use written sources. So that's basically the project we've been involved in.
Okay. And what about other than Mizoram? Because in Tripura, Arunachal Pradesh, Meghalaya, and the biggest state is Assam. So there is a variety of cultural diversities and the languages and the fauna and fountains. So in what way you got to understand this region? I want to know this.
Well, I'm still struggling with it like anybody else. It's very hard to be knowledgeable about more than a little bit of Northeast India because of all these different languages, as you say, different ecological situations, difficult political developments. You can only sort of grasp bits of it. And the more I sort of learn about it, the more I realize that in India, people often think of Northeast India as a problem for the state, for the nation. But when you're in Northeast India, you realize India is a problem for the Northeast because they are seen as one group. And of course, if you realize that Northeast India is also only 70 years old, before partition, it didn't exist. It was just part of the much larger British India.
That's true.
And so it's very much a victim of partition, like some other parts. People hardly think of it like that. But what happened at partition was that various groups that had developed their own sort of links with the outside world were suddenly forced into this straitjacket of Northeast India. And for instance, if you think of Mizoram, much of the contact with the outside world from Mizoram was through Chittagong, which is now in Bangladesh, and through Sitwe or Achab, which is now in Arakan. That's the way people moved in and out. Suddenly, this was no longer possible, so people had to move through the north into Assam, which was very cumbersome and still is a long way. So partition meant that not only in Mizoram, but in all kinds of different areas in Northeast India, people had to reorient themselves. And that is a process that is not sufficiently recognized, I think.
It's time for the short break, and we will be back soon.
Aimed at protecting the marine environment and human health, all Indian ships will now have to comply with the anti-fouling systems. Will the new merchant shipping law protect India's fragile marine environment?
How do you see this impacting the seamen?
This is going to impact a lot on their health.
Watch our new episode of Law of the Land on the merchant shipping law on Rajya Sabha TV.
Welcome back. Today we are talking Professor Willem Schendel from University of Amsterdam on the northeastern states of India. Professor Schendel, this region is quite volatile in terms of insurgency, violence, and there is a lot of issues, and at the same time, one of the very educated region. I mean, if we talk about Mizoram, it is the second largest in terms of literacy. Then there's Tripura, that is also almost literate. But at the same time, there are problems of migration, the employment, and the new challenges. And your keynote address was on why Northeast India is not remote. So would you shed some light on that?
Yeah, about remoteness, what I wanted to put across in this lecture was really that if you look at the history of Mizoram after colonial rule, what is amazing is how quickly it developed links with parts of the world that you wouldn't realize at first. So I talked about connections with Southeast Asia quite early on, with France, when a group of people went from Mizoram to this First World War and served in France. Later with Japan, when the Second World War started and the Japanese forces came that way. And so the idea that places like Mizoram are inward looking and isolated is completely mistaken. They have a very long and early exposure to all kinds of different influences. And when you think of Mizoram today, that is what you have to keep in mind, that people took from all these experiences what they liked to become modern Mizos.
Right. A large part of northeastern states are linked with the international borders, you know. We have China, we have Myanmar, we have Bangladesh, and also a tiny state of Bhutan. So, I mean, in Arunachal Pradesh, there are different problems, while in Tripura and in Mizoram or in Manipur, there are different problems. So, what is your understanding about the sociology of these states?
Well, as you say yourself, the diversity is the main problem. There is not one solution to one set of problems. Each region, and even within the states that you're talking about, different regions have very different problems. If you look at Manipur, the central valley is a very different setup from the mountains around it. If you look at Tripura, western Tripura, which has been in a way overrun by refugees from East Pakistan, is now strongly Bengalized, if you wish. The east of Tripura is not, and so there's a lot of tension there between these different groups. And if you look at, say, Assam, of course, it's such a complicated state, even though it's now been truncated from what it was at the time of partition when it included most of these other states. It is still so variegated. In the West you have other problems like the Bodo issues. In the hills, again, it's a different story. So the idea that there is one fix for Northeast India, I think, is completely misleading. And what you need is much more fine-tuned dialogue between different groups of people to search for solutions.
It is said that the Northeast region is a backward region, and to some extent it's right to say that, because it is not fully developed or as much developed as other states in other part of the India. So what is your opinion about this backwardness of this region?
I wouldn't call it a backward region. It depends on what you mean, right? You were just
in terms of development.
Well, but if you talk in terms of literacy, there are areas that are very forward.
No, literacy is there, yes.
If you want to talk about economic resources, it's an area that is rich in resources. There is also a lot of poverty, but there's poverty in other parts of India as well.
Yes.
So it's difficult for me to use that word. Again, it's a mix. It is clear that there are lots of desires among the people of the Northeast that are not being met by the Indian state or not sufficiently being met. And I think what people there like most is to get a hearing and have their voices be taken seriously, rather than people who are outsiders deciding for them what's good for them.
No, but I'm saying it, Professor Schendel, because there is a consensus among the policymakers that there is a regional imbalances, there is regional disparity, and that was the reason a separate ministry was, set up for the development of the Northeast region, because there are problems. There are historical problems, there are social problems, there are some political problems as well. Then this insurgency is there, the violence is there. So although some of the states, not all the states, are literate, but they are lying backward in terms of employment, in terms of development. Development means social, political, and economic. So that was the reason I was asking you. And your what is the remedy for that? What is the solution in your opinion?
Sure, I was not denying that there are lots of problems in the Northeast. I'm not a policymaker. I'm an academic. It's always unwise to ask a historian about the future. So I don't claim to have the solutions, but I think one important thing is, as I said earlier, that people in the Northeast should be in charge of their own futures and should be able to discuss these freely. The fact that there are these violent conflicts means that political disagreements cannot be solved by other means, obviously, otherwise people wouldn't become violent. So it means that there is a lack of dialogue, a lack of communication. And I think the first thing is to improve that, and in order to improve communication, you have to know about each other. So that's why I think research on the Northeast by Northeasterners or outsiders is extremely important as a base from which to build a dialogue.
You have also discussed about the modernity in that region. And do you think we can say it is at par with the other part of the world? I mean, the people are coming up in the same way, or they are lacking somewhere?
I talked about modernity because very often people think of the region as being isolated from modern life and so on. And I wanted to show that in the case of Mizoram, this is a complete misconception, that people in Mizoram were often far ahead in their connections with the outside world and with modern ideas than people in other parts of India, and that it's only slowly dawning on people in what they call mainland India, in Northeast India, that this is the case. So the whole idea that comes with the term tribal, which is used for many of the populations of Northeast India, is very problematic. Of course, it's a legal term in India. That's why it's still being used. But outside India, tribal has been completely abandoned. I mean, anthropologists never use tribal because it's considered a very old-fashioned colonial term, separating a general advanced people from a tribal backward group. That is absolutely unacceptable in the 21st century. But that idea keeps coming back when you use terms like tribal.
One of the key problem is of migration from that region, and a lot of research work is going on, and a lot of been written, many books have come out. So what would you like to say about this migration?
Migration out of the region?
Yes.
Well, I think one of the main problems for people in Northeast India is to have to live under violence. So I'm not talking about the groups that actually fight, the Indian armed forces and the insurgent movements, but all the other people who find their environment disturbed, whose lives are never certain. So that is one important driver for people to leave the area, just this general sense of insecurity. Another reason, of course, is lack of jobs that pay well, and so that's happening. But in itself, migration is not a bad thing.
You have been traveling in Bangladesh and Myanmar and some other neighboring countries. What do you think, I mean, this part of India, the northeast, is really developing in a nice way, or is there or is it lagging behind from other regions or other countries?
There are certain countries that are less developed than Northeast India, and many that are more developed than Northeast India. There are certain things that are very slow in developing. What strikes you when you travel in the region is the very poor infrastructure. Roads are still very poor. You see them being constructed here and there, but once you get off the main roads, in many places, it's really hard going. So clearly, not too much money is invested in the infrastructure. So that's one. The other is for that reason, public transport is also quite difficult often. For example, a place like Mizoram doesn't have a railway, so traveling there is by bus and so on. So there's that sort of thing that's difficult. Other things that could be improved are a zillion. There's so many things that could be improved. But on the whole, if you look at Burma, Myanmar, and Bangladesh, there's not that much of a difference in terms of how things are developing.
Professor Willem Schendel, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you
very much. Thank you.